All right. Wonderful. Yeah, so thank you for taking the time today to talk a little bit with me about the planning stage in GitLab. So
Mhm.
I think as a product manager, I use many of the features that GitLab actually offers in that regard. And I just went through sort of the 12.1 kickoff document, and I'm actually very excited about some of the things that are coming up. So especially in plan for sort of all groups, the inheriting children epic start and due dates to parent epics. I think this is really cool. And then also the creating issues from epics and creating child epics from epics. I think this is really nice. So I'm super pumped that you're actually getting to that.
Awesome. Yeah. It's funny, like, because of just how planning works, like, and because I'm an engineering manager, by the time we plan something, I'm like, oh yeah, that's basically like, I'm not even really thinking about that right now, like, because it's like
Yes.
already like scheduled, like, and I'm sure you're the same, like, you're already thinking about the next thing.
Yes.
Um,
So what are you
so,
thinking about? What do you think is the next thing?
I mean, I'm not the product manager for Plan. The biggest issue I see at the moment for GitLab as an organization, but also for some of our, we've heard this, we actually heard this initially from a customer, and then we sort of span off to talking about how it works for GitLab. And I think Geo has this specifically as well, is that everything works at the, assume for planning, at the level of a top level group. So you have we have our GitLab org group, which contains like everything related to GitLab, the product. And you can add a label to that group. It will be available to any subgroups and sub-projects within that group. You can add a milestone, same thing. You can add an epic. You can add issues from any subgroups and so on. And boards also work the same way. The problem is we also have a GitLab com group, which has things to do with GitLab the company, and that because those don't share a top level group, you can't use a board that touches both. You can't use an epic that touches both. You can't have the same label that touches both. There are some features in GitLab to get around that. Like if you filter issues on your dashboard by label, it matches by title. So if you have the same label title in two groups, you can see it there, but it's not unified. And you could say that the answer is just put everything in a GitLab group, but we also have like, I think we have a data group or something like that, where the whole point of that group is that not everybody in GitLab can see what's in there, and our permissions only go one way in groups, which is that you can only give people more access as you go down a group hierarchy. So that's the thing we're thinking about in terms of like how the market works. I think that the term for these is like portfolios. So you have project management, which maps to GitLab projects, program management, which roughly maps to GitLab groups, although we have nested groups. So you could argue that we also have portfolio management, and then portfolio management is the next level up. So you could argue that portfolio management is possible because we have subgroups, but you could also argue that portfolio management would be a way of collecting things from different top level groups. And we heard from a customer about this as well, because they were like, we have a top level group per function in the organization essentially, and we want to be able to like do some of this stuff across all of them, and putting everything in one top level group seems really dumb because the instance is just for us. So like to have like the whole instance for us and then just like have one group in that instance, like to make the features work, doesn't seem ideal. So yeah, that's been on my mind a lot, as you can probably tell. I don't actually have a great answer for how we do that, but at the moment what we're thinking is potentially have a portfolio feature or whatever that lets you aggregate top level groups together and doesn't aggregate in terms of membership. Like it doesn't inherit
Mhm.
membership, but it does inherit the plan features I mentioned: epics, labels, boards, milestones, and then sort of go from there. Like maybe in other areas, like it would be useful to share stuff as well. Like obviously merge requests would be a good candidate, but just start with the plan stuff and see where it lands.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's
that was quite a long answer.
yeah, no, but I mean, like one thing that I'm thinking about a little bit. So what I at the moment you can already connect and say like this issue is related to that issue, and you can span that potentially, like if you said, like as you said, like within a group, that's fine, right? And then all of those things tend to work.
Yeah, so issue relationships actually works like they just like work between any two issues, like on the instance. As long as you have access to both of those issues, you can relate any two issues. And we could do that for epics as well. We could say, actually, we're not going to enforce any structure here. We're just going to let you add any issue to any epic, whether it's above, below, to the side of the epic, whatever. I think the reason we picked to do it the more enforced way first is that it's easier to go from stricter to more permissive than it is to then add the restriction afterwards. Yeah, like if we'd started with that and then we decided that actually it really made sense to have epics and like need to be enforced in this hierarchy that matches your groups, that would obviously be a nightmare. Like, you know, how do you migrate that data? Like, what do you do with ones that are already invalid? Like, you know, it's basically, it's not impossible, but it is a much bigger deal. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had also, and I'm not quite sure if this is the right forum, but I'll ask you anyways. So I have two things that are a little bit on my mind that I think are interesting for like a planning perspective. So I used to use some other like product management like softwares where I could have more sort of semantic relationships between issues and epics, and also like in a way to like sort of visualize the dependency graph of things. So rather than saying this is related to that, which, you know, tells you that there is a relationship, but it doesn't tell you why that relationship exists or what that relationship signifies. So for example, having the ability to say like, this is a dependency of that, right? Mm-hmm. Or like vice versa, or actually saying like, hey, you know, you need to, this needs to be implemented first, you know, before you can do these other things. And actually,
it's like blocks this, or this is, a dependency.
That would be, it's an interesting, like, and honestly, I'm not quite sure how reasonable that is. As in, you know, like I've used it, I've liked it, but in a way, you know, like humans are, I think, quite good at inferring these relationships themselves when you like look at the links, but you always have to actually look at, you know, like what is this thing, look at it, you know, like, and then kind of establish it, and opinions may vary. So I think that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think that is, when we added that feature, we did explicitly talk about like adding types of relationships in future, and I think that was like 2 years ago. We just haven't got around to it. Because I remember when we were implementing it, we were talking about like internally, like, do we call these two sides like A and B because they're arbitrary, because it's just a relationship? Do we call them like source and target or something like that implies some sort of relationship? And we ended up going with internally there's something like source and target, or like, you know, from and to, because if we add a relationship in future, then there will be like two sides of that relationship. Whereas if it's just related, like it doesn't really matter. Like, you know, they could be either way around. But we did have that in mind when we added it. I think the interesting thing about planning in general is like most of the stuff we add is a way of enforcing something you could already do, but you don't want to do it manually. Like, you know, instead of having an epic, what we used to have were like meta issues where we collect a bunch of issue links and we'd say like, okay, well, this needs to be done first and this needs to be done afterwards. And obviously, like at a certain point that gets very painful to manage, and you can't introspect on that. Like there's no API to that. Like it's just a description. So I think, it's a similar type of thing. We are, another thing that's coming, I don't know when exactly, because we had some issues with what we defined as an MVC for this, but like replacing the epic view with a tree. I don't remember if that was one of the things you talked about at the start. Like, so exactly. All the epics and issues within those epics are represented in a tree instead of having to click through and see those. So that's the sort of start to visualizing that, but obviously there's a bunch more we can do there as well.
Yeah. But I think this is like, I'd love that, because I think it's really, I guess I have a slightly hierarchical like structure in mind, right? I have like what I would like to do, and I mean this is something where we are like, I think, moving in the right direction, is like I can write very high level sort of vision epics, right, that span, you know, a large amount of time, and that should, you know, convey, you know, like the general direction. And I think for like any stage or category, you want maybe like 2 or 3 of them, and that is something that you want to put on the roadmap and say, like, hey, this is where we're going. But then, you know, within those are like sub epics, child epics, right? And they contain issues. And I'd love to be able to like either see it in the tree view, or to have it actually on the epic roadmap. where I can say like, this is the roadmap. I can select epics. I can see all the issues that are contained within that epic. I can see the milestones, at what these issues will be delivered. And then I can basically create a roadmap that is as detailed or as high level as I want, depending on the audience. I can also sort of focus on a very specific part of this and like go into depth.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I don't actually know if we have an issue to do what you described on the roadmap, but I can definitely see how it would, because with the tree view, the roadmap is almost like a rotating of the tree view.
Exactly.
And adding time in explicitly. And I think that would be really interesting to be able to sort of visualize that, like, this is the span of the epic, this is the span of the child epic, this is the span of the issues within the epics based on their milestones.
Because if I just
I'll
think
take a
of
look after this call if we have an issue for that, and if we don't,
that would be good, because if we don't, I tried to find it, but I didn't succeed, but I didn't look very hard. I can write it up.
Yeah, no, a lot of the time, like, so I think sometimes people worry that like you create an issue and there might already be one, because like we have like, so many open issues. And my perspective is generally that's fine. Like, obviously you don't want to waste the effort you put into creating the issue, but like, put a reasonable amount of effort in, but not too much, and that's fine. Expand epic to view issues and children epics in roadmap is currently on 12.2. So there we go. That sounds like it is what we want. So let me share that with you in the Zoom chat. But yeah, I think that does sort of match what you were talking about there, where you can expand a row and see like the detail of that row. Yeah, I think that would be very useful.
I think that would be useful, actually. And I think it's also interesting because it would allow, for example, some of the like things that we do right now, like the kickoff calls, right, to actually happen using a roadmap rather than a table where you basically go through things and you say like, hey, this is the release roadmap for that release. And it allows you to create interesting visualizations, like focusing on a specific aspect, right? On a release, on an epic, right? On like different things. And I think that's always really nice. And it helps, I think, get that more clearly.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. I think we're sort of, with VSM as well, which is now part of Manage, but like with all these things, we're sort of converging on like these tools that you can use to like arrange things in different ways. Like visually, it's like the same data, but you're just exposing it in a different way. So like, issues list and issue board is always a classic example for me. Like, with an issue board, you can arrange things like horizontally, and you might not arrange that for a workflow thing. Like, I know Eric, who's the product manager for Plan at the moment, uses a board that has milestone lists. So and then he will filter that by like direction issues or whatever. Like, by default, it shows all the Plan issues. But then, he can see like, okay, this is my like, not exactly roadmap, but this is like my sort of short term, like this is where I'm going with these direction issues. This is the progress we're going to make. And then, yeah, the epics view, the roadmaps view is sort of a higher level thing. But I think a different way of exposing that data.
Yeah, I think this is, there's probably not one way, like the one way to do it. There's multiple ways to like slice like data in interesting ways. But I think from a sort of plan perspective, also from a competitive perspective, I think these are things that their entire like software suites that focus on like making roadmaps desirable, right, for like presentation purposes. And I think that is something where that's quite interesting, and like just in my opinion. So also, I think maybe technically this is a question for you, because I've worked with things where as soon as I make a change on my roadmap and I say like, hey, add these issues, I had to re-render the entire page. And it very quickly annoyed me. And so I think having sort of a dynamic way of like refreshing these visualizations and like adding things without having to re-render everything, I don't know how technically challenging that is.
Yeah, it's mainly a front-end question, I guess, so it's hard for me to answer that in too much detail. I can tell you that on a slightly related note, the reason the epic tree may or may not be in 12.0 is because when we added the initial version, like, I was talking about what's the MVC here. So the MVC from an implementation perspective is to have it like read-only. But right now you can drag epics and issues around to like reorder them. So if we replace the view with one where you can't do that, then we've like regressed functionality. So even if from an implementation perspective, we start with read only and then add the ability to drag things around, we still need to ship that as one thing to customers. We did, to users. We did talk a little bit about like having the option of the two views, but the problem was because we're going to get rid of the old view shortly anyway, it seemed dumb to like add the option for like what would probably be one release and then remove it. We'd rather just like, put it behind the feature flag and then make it available when it's ready. But that was a thing that actually stopped that, because you'll be able to drag an issue through the hierarchy, not just within its own epic. Once it's in a tree view, like you'd expect, so you'll be able to drag an issue from a parent epic to a child epic, or vice versa, or to a sibling epic, as well as reordering it.
Which is cool.
Yes, but it's more work.
Yeah, I have a suspicion most interesting things tend to be, at least a little bit more work. So
it's always great when you can get a quick win, but sometimes more of a slow win.
I mean, just actually having child epics and being able to render a hierarchy or a tree is really interesting.
Yep.
These are fun data structures in any case, right? You can do interesting things with them. So
as a product manager, like and someone who's used GitLab quite a lot, I think in the past, like what's the biggest thing that you feel like you missed from other tools? Like it might not be, you could say something that's not like feasible for us to do soon, like that's fine. I'm just curious about like what's the biggest pain point you feel when using GitLab for this stuff.
So I actually, like one of the biggest pain points, like when we had to make a decision in my previous slide on what to use, was that epics were not available at that time, and so that is something where I was just like, I can't handle that. It's it makes no sense to me. I think at the moment, so a couple of things. We talked about the roadmaps. I wish we had like a more sort of complete roadmap experience. I think roadmaps are such a powerful way to convey to like multiple audiences what you're after at different levels. I think for me as a product manager, I'd love to be able to produce a roadmap for engineers, right? And like people at GitLab and say like, this is what we're going to do. Look at it, right? Visually, I'd love to present a roadmap that is compelling to customers at a level where they really understand the value that we're bringing. And then like a very sort of high level, where are we going? What's happening in the next 3 months? So that's something that's cool. I think, and that's maybe sort of a product manager like issue. I don't know.
Right, but like the plan stage is like
so I think,
pretty fairly targeted at product managers, right? Like
I think the one thing that I think we don't do at the moment that I wish we did better, and that confused me a lot in the beginning, is we at GitLab we use OKRs, so objectives and key results, and I think they're really powerful. And I was used to sort of always asking myself when I would create an epic or even at an issue level, to be able to say like, okay, why are we doing this? Like what objective are we actually like driving forward here? And I think at the moment we don't really have a way to say like this thing, right, relates to one of the like objectives that we are driving forward with those key results. And I think you can do that by labeling, right, and by doing it in that way. So I think that there are obviously ways of handling it. You can create issues that are OKRs and link them. But I think having an explicit layer that handles OKRs would be really cool, in my view.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. It's funny when you mentioned labels, I was like, the advantage and the problem with labels is that you can use them for so many things. Yeah. And I think they're quite, again, sort of going back to what we were talking about earlier, they're quite unstructured. And if you want a more explicit structure, it's hard to, we do have some ways of creating that. Like now we have scoped labels where they're mutually exclusive, but like fundamentally it's quite hard to enforce a structure using something as free as labels, which is great as well, because it's a very powerful tool if you have a lot of,
but it gets crowded very easily, right?
Yeah, exactly. They also share the same visual space.
I think this is maybe more relevant on an epic level. So if I say like this is an epic, and in my mind, an epic usually groups a bunch of issues that implement features, and I always say like, okay, if all the issues that are like in an epic are actually implemented, then the epic should ideally be closed, right?
Yes.
So if that's true. So what I would love is sort of on an epic level, information saying like this epic contributes in a measurable way to a key result, that is relevant to an objective, and making that really, really clear. And I think having that functionality sort of integrated, I think would be quite cool.
Yes, I mean, another way you could do it at the moment is create epics for the objectives and then have sub epics for those. But again, there's nothing stopping you from having an epic that's not a child of an objective.
Yes.
Like, there's nothing stopping you from just like creating an epic at the top level, essentially, and saying like, this is my epic, we're going to work on it. It doesn't relate to any of the objectives, but I don't care, we're going to work on it.
Yes.
Which, yeah. So yeah, no, I think that's interesting.
Yeah, that's another one where I actually, it's on my list to follow up if that is like written down somewhere, because if it's not, I will do that.
Yeah, I'm definitely not aware of something like that, but Eric, the product manager, might know more about.
Yeah,
that.
we had a tiny discussion, and I think I may need to like pick that up again. But
okay.
Yeah, so I'll add that as one of my action items from this.
Cool. Yeah, well, I wasn't really expecting to come out of it with action items. I was just curious about how you use things, what you're excited about, what you feel like is missing, and yeah, it was great to have the chat. Anything else you wanted to bring up before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I wanted to like say is that it's amazing and wonderful that you took the time. So thanks very much. I know you're quite involved.
Well, as you saw from my calendar today, I don't really have much on today in terms of meetings. So there's that.
That's true, but it just means that you will do other things, right? I think this is, I'm not assuming that because you have no meetings, you are, like sipping, like a nice drink in your living room. So
yeah, no, that's true. No problem. It was great to speak to you as well. I guess I'll speak to you around. If you upload this to YouTube afterwards, let me know and I'll add it to the plan playlist and whatnot. But yeah, it was great speaking to you, Fabian.
I will have a look how that works. So
yeah, I can talk you through it on Slack if you need help.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.